somebody should be held accountable, because it's not acceptable, and it's there's got to be a change of culture at the BBC so that this sort of thing does not happen again, and that means somebody taking the blame for it, carrying the can for it.
Well, the BBC's Director General is facing criticism today after it was revealed Tim Davie was at the Glastonbury Festival when Bob Vylan led chants of death, death, death to the IDF. It has raised questions as to whether the BBC boss should have intervened and pulled the live broadcast of the performance. This morning, we spoke to David Elstein, a former BBC producer and chief executive of Channel 5. He told us the BBC has made serious mistakes.
Maybe somebody didn't understand the significance of it, kill every Jewish soldier you can find. But even so, if you can put up the caption, you can cut the feed. There's the BBC failed to prepare properly, failed to act properly, and is now deep in the doo-doo as a result. And poor old Tim Davie was being lambasted in the House of Commons yesterday implicitly by Lisa Nandy, and rightly so.
Deep in the doo-doo, that's a technical term for the situation. In the next half hour, we'll discuss Starmer as he approaches his premiership's first birthday. What does the man stand for, and what direction is his government heading in? We'll also continue that discussion on Britain's falling birth rate and whether pronatalism should be government strategy. Also, how accountable should the leaders of organisations be when serious mistakes are made? Lots of people get called for the head of people all the time. Is that the right response? And we'll try and work out who Manveen and William Hague think are cool.
William, your piece in the Times today, because you're essentially asking what Keir Starmer's big idea for government is and warning that unless he can express the purpose of his government, he will still look lost. But William, I was really interested in your reflection about the reason that we have an office of the Prime Minister is it has to be somebody who's very good at multitasking, and maybe the Labour leader isn't doing so well at that.
Yeah, well, I was having a bit of a go at him at that. I was comparing him in my column today to William Pitt. That's somebody I wrote a biography of, who was, giving just an example of a day in the 1790s when he had to deal with so many multiple diplomatic, military, economic and parliamentary matters. But he managed to get through them all on the 26th of May, 1797. And that was just I'm just picking a day there. So this is in the job of Prime Minister. Otherwise, we might as well just have a Chancellor of the Exchequer and a Foreign Secretary and a Home Secretary, and they all do their own thing. This is the point of a Prime Minister, to multitask and to give a coherence to the whole to everybody's work in government. So I do think what we saw last week was a serious failing, say, well, I'm busy with the NATO summit, so I didn't focus on the disability controversy in Parliament. Well, that's what you have to do. You have to be sitting at the NATO summit thinking about all of that and keeping control of it. So, but the multitasking is only one symptom of the ability to give a coherent programme overall. And I think there the Prime Minister is struggling. I've even helpfully set out in my column what that could be. So he could just read it and adopt the what I'm suggesting, of course.
Well, let our listeners know what you think that he ought to do then, because it's actually, you put forth a really strong argument. You list all of the things where this country at the moment is falling down. What do you think he could actually do to convince people that he can right it again?
Well, he actually is doing quite a lot of the right things, so this is not just, it's not a diatribe against him. But they don't seem to be part of the same picture to the average voter, or even the average member of the government, or a Labour member of Parliament, for that matter. So I'm saying, look, it should be very clear to a Prime Minister, we're entering this really turbulent, dangerous age in the world. You can see that from all the conflicts going on in the world. The way AI is about to change the world of work. Get the country ready for a turbulent age. That does mean more defense. It does mean more investment in technology. It does mean getting people off all their ultra-processed food so we're not all sick. It does mean reforming the welfare system. Otherwise, we're going to spend more on sickness benefits. We already are spending more on sickness benefits than the whole defense budget or the whole schools budget. And then make a proper job of it with a long-term plan, instead of Rachel Reeves coming up with a kind of random taking away of money from a group that she just thought of just before a budget, which is really what's happened in the last year. It's up to a prime minister to give coherence to that and sort it all out. So that's what I'm suggesting to him. Maybe he'll read it this morning.
I'm sure he'll read it. Just a small task on his plate, nothing major, William. Manveen, part of the sort of study of what William is saying is the welfare bill, the way that this has been handled. I think it's fair to say, and the government has recognised this, that it went into this potentially in the wrong way. And it is something that William reflects in his column, that it looked very much like Rachel Reeves picking an area of the welfare budget that they could get some savings from quite quickly and introducing reform, the idea of reform that way, instead of a more fundamental change. Do you think that, given what's happened with welfare, given the size of the rebellion, it's now out of the question for the government to do any kind of fundamental reform in this area?
I think it would be a huge mistake if that was the lesson they took from it. I think that, as William quite rightly points out, the lesson they should take is their handling of it. They didn't manage to give a coherent narrative to what they were doing. They didn't manage to set out enough of a story that people could follow it and understand what the vision was, where this would get us. And it's partly because, as William says, they did it very cack-handedly. They just sort of, they picked on pips rather than looking at, I think everybody is alarmed when they realise that the welfare bill has gone up by 45% in the last few years. And a lot of it is young people with mental health problems, which, is a serious problem. But is paying them to stay at home going to solve it? Probably not. And I think that actually if you were to engage people in a national conversation around this, people would probably agree. You just need to be able to have that conversation instead of going in and sort of hitting pips and making it about whether people can wash themselves above or below the waist. It just sort of felt like it was a really cack-handed cut, an impossible one for so many backbenchers and Labour to support. When even today, with the reforms that they've sort of brought in, with the sort of the U-turn they've had, they're still promising to only plunge 150,000 people into poverty. It's a tough one for a lot of Labour to support. They've just done it very badly without sort of setting out the wider argument for reform or explaining why it's so necessary right now at a time where, it really is urgent. William sort of sets this out brilliantly in his column. If you haven't read it, do. But we are living in an era where all the promises that we were sort of born to, the post-war settlement, the idea of a rules-based system are all just crumbling. The edifice is crumbling around us. It's that brilliant Gramsci line, the old world is dead, the new one is struggling to be born, now is a time of monsters. What we need more than ever is a sense of a vision of how we as a country emerge from that, how we sort of re-establish ourselves in this new world order, what our specific role is going to be, how we're going to work with other partners, what we're going to represent and how we're going to survive at such a difficult moment. And none of that's really being addressed because Starmer seems almost afraid of, vision is tied closely to ideology. And he's made it very clear several times that, he says he's unburdened by ideology, but it does also mean nobody quite knows where we're headed or why. And that's the fundamental problem.
But is that not just honest, man? Because no one knows, because these are too difficult for government to tackle. We live in a culture where mental health has gone from being not mentioned and demonised to being mentioned all the time and pathologised. And therefore, who can really alter an entire culture to say what sort of mental condition requires a bit of friendly support, what requires state intervention? We have no concept whatsoever what AI will do to the job force and therefore the tax base and therefore what constitutes a normal human life anymore. And so why would Keir Starmer have a clue about that, Manveen? Because no one else does.
But burying our head in the sand doesn't help. He doesn't have to know specifically, what mental health problem constitutes something where you can't work versus what doesn't. He needs to set out a vision where we want to try and get as many people living as full a life as possible, back to work, doing things that will make them feel like they're having a meaningful life. That's not a bad vision to sort of set out for the country. And then you set out the job of working out exactly where those boundaries are, where the new guidelines should be. Until you've expressed that vision, though, it's very hard for anybody working under you to work out who should and shouldn't, be working, who should and shouldn't be getting benefits. And I think he just seems absolutely terrified of pinning his colours to a mast. I think, and it's probably because, he's come up through a party which was so riven by factions and ideological strife that he's just completely against having an ideology of his own. And I think that's part of the problem. He needs to have a sense of where he wants the country to go. Otherwise, how on earth will he take people with him?
William, you've known a lot of prime ministers, well, a few prime ministers in your time. Which one of them do you think best encompassed what you're writing about in your column today? The ability to have a vision, to translate and communicate it, and to multitask, crucially.
Well, I think very top of the list would be Margaret Thatcher, really, whatever you think of her, whatever people think good or bad of her policies. She was definitely able to do that. There was no doubt people could see where she was taking the country, and she was on top of the whole, the workings of the whole of government, and famously used to be still writing things in the, on the memos in her red boxes at 2 a.m. Every day, making sure the whole government was going in the same direction. So she was good. I mean, and she also, of course, she made a big thing of being able to multitask. This was where a woman had an advantage because she was the housewife who was also happened to be the prime minister. So she made a huge virtue of that. But she was genuinely good at knowing everything that was going on while keeping it in a coherent sense of direction. So a really good role model, I think.
Let's move on to talk about another big idea, a big issue where it's very hard for the government to get involved, Manveen, because this question of, is it a good thing or a bad thing that we have a reducing birth rate, and how much can the government change the culture around it? Because quite a lot of people get in touch with this program and say, we have too many people, AI is coming, we don't need more young people, we're just going to have to learn how to live with old age better, and technology will answer that. And if we have a smaller population, hooray for us, there'll be less pressure on resources. The demographer who had on didn't agree with that at all. But do you think the government should be tackling, as part of a big vision, the low birth rate?
I think it's really difficult. I can understand why Keir Starmer doesn't seem to want to touch this. It does feel a little bit like social engineering. At the same time, there is something has gone wrong. And if the reason the birth rate is falling is because of factors that politicians can affect, whether it's the price of childcare or the fact that people find it so hard to get onto the housing ladder now that they don't feel like they're able to settle down and have a family for much, much, much longer. They're doing it much later in life, if they're doing it at all. Those are things that they can affect, and they probably should, just to have a better society. That's not sort of telling people they've got to have babies. It's actually just making sure we're a bit better, more functional society. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I do worry about the sort of, in Italy, they're already telling people they should be having, they need another 500,000 kids a year, and that all gets quite difficult, quite difficult to sort of to tell people they need to stop procreating soon.
The idea that the government, in the form of Keir Starmer or Jonathan Reynolds, bustles into the bedroom and starts.
I can't imagine anything worse.
Starts directing proceedings.
I don't think anybody, apart from you, is suggesting that.
No, just lift your legs up. No, none of that.
Stig, enough.
William Hague, is it a good thing or not a good thing? Is that a problem? And how big a problem is it? Because it strikes me as a massive societal shaping problem.
Yes, it is a bit. It raises a lot of issue, because of course it changes everything you do about schools and about pensions, and so if you get a different age distribution of the population, but it's completely futile, in my view,
really?
for governments to get into this. The birth rate is falling all over the world, nearly all over the world, and in many cases more dramatically than in the UK. Governments in other countries have been trying to do things about that, with a total lack of success, because this seems to be driven by urbanization, there's more people living in towns and cities, and by education. And as women become more educated, which is a good thing in the world, there are fewer babies in the world. So instead of trying to fight that, which will prove impossible, I think it's best to concentrate on coping with the consequences of that. And bearing in mind, as some of those people who phone and text in are saying, there isn't a right number of people in the world. It's not like there is a requirement by the planet Earth that you have to have 8 billion people. It got by perfectly well with far fewer people in the past.
Well, apparently, according to our demographer, the world, you might say this is correlation and this is not causation, but when there was 4 billion, he said the world was poorer. When there was 2 billion, the world was poorer still. So actually, progress has mirrored the population explosion.
Well, yes, I think he might be mixing up cause and effect there in that progress in terms of being able to fight disease and have good sanitation and so on. It has led to a population explosion, but it was that quite small number of people around when the Industrial Revolution started who managed to come up with all of those things that then led to the population explosion. So he might have got his causation in reverse there, I suspect.
William and Manveen, stay right where you are. We've still got to talk about accountability of leadership and Manveen, Rana and William Hague, are you cool? I don't think you can answer that and still be cool. Answer that yourselves and still be cool. But we'll find out.
About each other.
Yes, that's a good idea. Prepare your answers now. I just have to read this message out from Anna. It's an email, actually. Anna says, "Hi there. Regarding falling birth rates, I have a long email full of supporting research in my head. However, as I was up all night with a fractious toddler while my husband slept soundly and I now have a full-time job to go to and an enormous mental load to bear, I simply don't have the energy. When considering why women stop after having one child, I suggest looking closer to home." Yes. Yeah. It's a good point, Anna.
Get a better husband, Anna.
Well,
is what I would suggest.
I think, Anna, I hope you get some more sleep, what I would say.
I definitely empathise with that.
Let's move on, shall we, and talk about accountability, because the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, is under pressure after what happened at the Glastonbury Festival over the weekend. A BBC source says Davie himself took the decision not to allow viewers to see the set by rap duo Bob Vylan on demand on the iPlayer. However, you could still see what happened for several hours on the live stream. The BBC source says pulling the live stream would have brought about some challenges, but with hindsight, they would have taken it down. William, what do you make of this? It's now moved on, this row, from the original comments, the remarks that were made by this artist at the festival, to bigger questions about the BBC's process and, crucially, accountability. Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary in the Commons yesterday, really seemed quite cross with Tim Davie. Is this now on him, do you think?
Well, I don't know that it's on him. I'd be sorry if it was on him, because I think in general does a good job at the BBC. But it's on somebody. I mean, it could be him. But the question is there a clear policy about this? Because this is quite a predictable problem that could arise. And somebody should have set a policy and say, things like this, you pull the plug. So is it that there's a policy and somebody didn't do it? Or is it that there's no policy? And that really helps you then work out who is accountable, because if somebody didn't implement an agreed policy, well, then it's their fault. But if there isn't a policy, well, then the fault goes closer to the top. So I would want to know the answer to that question. But it's somebody should be held accountable, because it's not acceptable. And it's there's got to be a change of culture at the BBC so that this sort of thing does not happen again. And that means somebody taking the blame for it, carrying the can for it.
Manveen, do you think, given what William's saying about processes, I think the BBC had said the week before it did have a new system in place for this kind of content, but clearly on the day it just didn't work, or maybe because it was a live stream, maybe because it was happening in the moment. But we heard from Hugo Rifkind, who was at the festival. He joined us on the programme earlier, and he said, look, it was a small group of people, a smallish crowd. The festival is the same size as Oxford. He's Jewish. He didn't feel unsafe there. And he said, I don't believe anybody Jewish felt unsafe there. Did you hear any of Bob Vylan's set?
No, not a bit. Like the vast majority of people who were there, I was somewhere else.
So go on then, give us your take on because it's obviously caused a significant row. It's cast a lot of judgment over the festival, the type of people who go to the festival, the type of people's views who go to the festival. How do you feel about it?
Okay, so I guess first up, obviously it was anti-Semitic, completely anti-Semitic. You can see it's almost impossible to imagine that rap group, any rap group, leading a chant like that about kind of any other military force on Earth or almost in history. If America was bombing somewhere, I think people would have been like, oh, hang on, death to the US Army, that seems a bit strong. Even death to ISIS, I'm not sure liberal sentiments have allowed people to chant along. When it's the IDF, something has happened in our culture that makes a lot of people go, that's kind of different. Like Jews have turned into orcs, like not quite afforded the normal humanity of kind of everywhere else. All that being said, the idea that the festival generally was some kind of anti-Semitic hate fest. Giles Corran's written a very funny column along those lines this morning, like he always does. I must say, I didn't know this had happened until the next day. when I checked the news. Most of the people I hung out with at the festival were off-duty journalists. Most people didn't know it would happen. I think a lot of people quite often think of Glastonbury as being a bit like perhaps the last night of the proms, where there's something on and everybody's watching it and everybody's cheering along to the same thing. It's a festival with a population the size of Oxford. There are 130-something stages. Nobody is ever seeing the same thing. There is not a dominant vibe. There's nothing like that. So, I mean, in general terms, I'd say there were probably far fewer Palestinian flags and things like that than there were last year. There wasn't a great kind of sentiment of that kind of politics, or indeed of any kind of politics. But I think there is obviously something that sort of seeped in to culture about how people are understandably very angry about what's going on in Gaza, but there is something worse than a clumsiness there that this really exemplified.
And you are Jewish. I mean,
yeah.
I can tell really from what you're saying that you felt safe at the festival. But there are people there are people who have spoken out, Jewish people who attended Glastonbury, who said that they didn't feel safe.
I find that peculiar. I can't imagine what would have made them. I mean, I was there with, I have several Jewish friends who were there. I can understand people might feel uncomfortable standing behind a Palestinian flag. I'd even go as far as to say I don't believe there are people who felt literally unsafe at the festival. I just don't believe that.
Did you see any Israeli flags?
No.
Would you ever have done at Glastonbury? So I feel I've seen Israeli flags at Glastonbury on the TV.
Yeah, I think you might have done. You might have done in the past. I feel like there was perhaps one floating around last year that you saw quite a lot. But I mean, really, not that many Palestinian flags in any given crowd of 50, 100,000 people. You might see 4 or 5.
Yeah, it's really good to hear your perspective, because I think a lot of the reporting around it has focused on this sense that, I mean, it was a crowd of around 30,000 people, I think.
Yeah, out of 210,000 or thereabouts.
Yeah, I think even with that, lots of people still find it unbelievable that people would chant along to something like that and feel willing to do that. But clearly it's not, your view, representative.
I'm not saying it's super. It's certainly not super.
Exactly.
But you've also got to bear in mind, these are often people who've been drinking for 3 solid days. And there are also people who are having their weekend where they're out of their normal lives. People will chant along to anything. I mean, I can't even say...
But you wouldn't chant along to that, would you? If you were in that crowd, you wouldn't chant along to that.
No, of course not. But then I can remember when Dave Grohl got about 100, whatever, filled out the pyramid stage, well over 100,000 people, to just basically chant along to the F word, because he wanted to break Adele's record for profanity on stage. And I think for an awful lot of people, they'll chant along to imbecilic things in the same way that they chant along to that. It's not fundamentally a political gathering. I think that's a really important thing. It just fundamentally isn't.
Have we got the balance right on this question, do you think?
Well, that, I think, is the crucial part, because even if you did have a process in place, if you did have a policy on this, which I think they must have done, I don't think you could go into a Glastonbury knowing that Kneecap was performing and you'd already made the decision not to show that performance without thinking, what if others come up with protest signs? The question is, where is the line? It's a really difficult one to answer, especially sort of on the spot in the middle of a big performance. But, I think most people would think death is inappropriate. It does feel like it crossed the line, but it's a music performance and they do, that's what they're there for. They push boundaries. And I think actually it comes down to the definition of anti-Semitism. And that's a really core question. In America at the moment, they're in the process of changing the definition of anti-Semitism to include all criticism of the Israeli government, of Benjamin Netanyahu. That would qualify as anti-Semitism, which I think most people would most people would agree is sort of stifling free speech. And it's a political statement. It's not anti-Semitic to say you disagree with the policies of a government. The IDF is an army. How would we have felt if they were sort of saying death to the Red Army? Or, we've had songs in this country about the Germans, not terribly flattering ones, during the World War. At what point are they criticising the actions of an army at a time where there is a very contentious war, where a lot of people would say that war crimes have been criticised? Should we be stopping artists from reflecting that? Or are they going to incite violence against Jewish people? And I think it's really interesting that Hugo was there and didn't think that it would have that. Nobody felt unsafe being there. And I think it's such a delicate line. You've got to be really careful that you don't stop artists being able to talk about something awful happening in the world and to reflect their frustration at the way an army is conducting a campaign, without it necessarily being anti-Semitic.
It's also, it shows how hard it might be to do in the moment, but the question is, have you put the processes in place to enable you to make that decision rationally? And
well, to decide what counts as anti-Semitic and what counts as political comment. I mean, I think that's the harder decision, and I'm not sure they will have had a definition that, I think death to the IDF would sort of probably fall on a line where, you could argue it either way.
Well, I think let's be clear about what we're talking about here. That remark about the IDF, the BBC itself has said they don't believe it is anti-Semitic, but there were other comments in the feed that were earlier than that particular comment, that chant, that they do consider to be anti-Semitic sentiments. That's what they've said in a statement. So I think that it's not just the one event in that performance. And William, as you said, if there isn't a process, I mean, what do you think the government might do next here? Lisa Nandy's tone really struck me yesterday. Do you think there's a possibility that could there be an investigation into this? Should there be?
Well, you'd want, if you're the minister, you want a clear explanation from the BBC, and then you want to know that somebody has been, you want to know who is accountable and what the BBC are going to do about it. So, that's what, if I was the minister, I'd want that. I'd want BBC leadership in my office explaining all of that this afternoon. So maybe that will happen. That's what ought to happen.
Yeah. Before we go, we tried to define the epitome of cool on Times Radio this morning, unsuccessfully in many ways. Researchers say that people across the world recognise the personality traits that make you cool, being extrovert, adventurous, open to experience, autonomous, powerful, and a little hedonistic. That just makes you annoying, I think. That's just that very definition of annoying. I can't believe that's what they've agreed with. We came up with not caring what other people think, not allowing yourself to be sort of heated up by the world.
But not in an aggressive way, though.
Yeah, exactly. Manveen Rana, are you cool? Is William Hague cool? You can answer any way you like.
I think Kate was right. I think anyone who classifies themselves as cool automatically isn't. I can't imagine anything worse.
It's a bit like saying, I'm mad me. No.
I know. God, I mean, it just sort of makes you feel slightly queasy. But William, yes, of course, always. Unflappable and cool in many ways.
William Hague, did your decision to wear the baseball cap render you completely removed from all questions of cool for the remainder of your life?
I wasn't going to mention that.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think it did, actually. So I'm definitely not claiming to be cool. But Manveen is very cool.
There we go. Oh, come on, put the boot in.
No, the coolest presenter in the history of the Story podcast.
Again, not up against particularly stiff competition. I think we're aiming low. We're aiming low here this morning on Time. That should be the motto for breakfast.
Aiming low and winning.
Aiming low and sometimes winning.
Aiming low and winning. That's what we do here on Breakfast. William, thank you very much for joining us. Manveen, thank you for being with us this morning. Great to have you both.